Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our afternoon session. We're aiming to finish right at 4 o'clock, so that's why we're moving things along. And we want to give you, for looking at a cost-benefit analysis, as much benefit for the small cost that's involved in this conference from your point of view. So we want to make it as valuable as possible, and that's why we're trying to put in plenty of presentations to kind of assist all of our learning. So this afternoon session is about strategic planning, and we've got 3 presentations which really kind of think about the broader strategic ideas around linear reserve environmental management. We've then got an opportunity to ask questions to the panel, but also previous presenters. And I've just checked the Slido questions, and I think we've got close to 30. Now, we won't be able to go through all of those, obviously, in about half an hour that we've got, or 40 minutes, but we'll try our best. But also, we will receive some questions to the panel from you as the audience. So that looks like a really interesting session. So just bear with us. We're now moving into our last part of the forum. And to start with, we are very fortunate to have Julie Revallian from Transport for New South Wales. And Julie is going to present on biodiversity initiatives and transport. Julie Revallian.
Yes, thank you, Neil. My name's Julie Revallian, and I'm the Senior Specialist of Biodiversity for Transport. Now, the title of the talk today I had was quite generic, and I did hope that I'll be able to present a new biodiversity policy that we're trying to establish in transport, but unfortunately the approvals haven't quite come through, so this isn't going to be quite as strategic as you might have hoped. But I'm going to talk to you about another important program that we've done, being the management of mature trees in the road corridor, given the risks posed by bushfire. Is that my phone? It is. I was worrying about that. I know. So in what could be a career-limiting presentation. But first I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connection to the lands and waters of New South Wales. Now, I always think that that particular, it's an important introduction, but I think if you're interested and when you work in biodiversity conservation, I think it's important to understand that biodiversity, as we understand it, is just part of a larger whole understood by Aboriginal people as being country. I was struck by this quote in a report prepared by the Australian Heritage Commission in 1996, so it's been with me for a while. Country in Aboriginal English is not only a common noun, but a proper noun. People will talk about country in the same way as they would talk about a person. They speak to country, sing to country, visit country, worry about country, feel sorry for country and long for country. People say that country knows, hears, smells, takes notice, takes care, is sorry or is happy. So today, as we stand in the country of the Gadigal people, I would like to acknowledge how important this understanding is of country to anyone concerned with the conservation of biodiversity in New South Wales. That's the closest I could get to home in the bush, so hope that works. Rightio. So today I'll be giving a brief background to the program, perhaps not some of its political dynamics, but how the tree hazards were assessed, how the environmental impact process worked, and our key learnings from the program. Now, you'll see some tables and flowcharts that I know you won't be able to read, but if you are interested in them, I'm happy to send them to you, and I'll give you my email address. I'll give my email address at the end of the presentation, and you can just email me. So we'll be going through the actual what the program is, what the assessment is, what environmental assessment we've done, and our learnings. So the 2019-2020 bushfire season followed by wet weather and severe storms devastated communities across New South Wales and severely impacted transport infrastructure. A critical problem during and after emergency operations was road closure due to tree failure. Sections of the Kings Highway, Bruxner, Waterfall Way, Oxley Highway, Gwydir, Great Western Highway, the Alpine Way, the Putty Road and the M1 were all closed for tree management and road repair, in some cases for many weeks. And I'm just talking about the roads that Transport is responsible for keeping it opening. Obviously, local government would have also had that issue times 10. So in response to that, we commenced what's called the Bushfire Resilience Program. And it's essentially a program in its first stages of vegetation management on critical transport corridors. And we started with the Gwydir and the Bruxner and the Princes Highway. So it's mainly the roads that either go over the ranges through those huge, the vegetated ranges, or the Princes Highway, which also bisects a great deal of bush. It was a risk-based assessment process, was used involving a pre-assessment process to identify high-risk areas for tree failure, an on-ground assessment process to identify actual individual trees at risk of failure, their environmental value and what management interventions might be required, and an REF determination process to accommodate the environmental approvals. All data was held in an asset management system, and it was something of a first for transport because it had to be delivered very, very quickly. And we normally make use of a lot of external consultants and we go through quite a long process to get to these approvals, but in this case we wanted to do it in quite a streamlined way. So by November 2020, 350 k's of the Princes and the Gwydir highways had been assessed and 1,902 hazardous trees had been removed. Now, the program has now been extended to other priority corridors in New South Wales. So, in terms of what happened, project engineers accompanied by an arborist typically identified candidate road segments for assessment. Typically, these involved areas with large mature trees on the road edge. And mostly they did it by car. They drove slowly down the road and identified the areas that needed to be assessed. Now, back at the office, we used the New South Wales Spatial Digital Twin, which you haven't found yet. I encourage you to find. It's really easy to use and access a whole lot of data. It was used as an easy way to access relevant available spatial data. So essential layers for us was obviously cadastral information, and particularly where our roads border onto National Park and to state forests. A lot of our roads are very old and the boundaries of them aren't necessarily clear, so there's sort of endless issues about where the actual end of the road reserve is. We work through those issues. The biodiversity values map, which is a map produced by DPE for a particular regulatory purpose, but it is also a collation of a whole lot of environmental layers put together on the one map. So we made use of that, and important areas, obviously coastal wetlands, littoral rainforest, endangered ecological communities, those things. We also know that tree removal can be a particular problem, a connectivity problem for glider species. So we wanted a particular focus on gliders, so we created up our own spatial layer from Bionet of threatened glider records. Cultural heritage checks was also done. We consulted internally with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Officers, checked with the AHIMS database, and for local councils' heritage items and significant tree registers. So the final step was to exclude areas of high risk from this process. National Park reserves with uncertain road reserve boundaries and areas of known natural and cultural heritage significance. These areas were subject to a separate environmental impact assessment and process and a separate REF determination that happened over a larger and longer time frame. So the next step was a coordinated on-ground assessment, which identified, which basically was there to identify areas containing trees at risk of failure. So The assessment was a team sort of effort. There was the project engineer, and they're responsible for the actual doing the job and organising the teams that do the job. An arborist to inspect the trees for tree health, environment staff to do the environmental impact assessment, cultural heritage staff where they were deemed necessary, and a data acquisition officer to bring it all together and put it in the system. And of course we needed safety controls because we were walking the road's edge and the road had to be closed for that. The next step with the arborist would identify trees that require further assessment. Trees were typically dead, damaged, missing their canopy, leaning, damaged at the roots or fire scarred, and all had to be orientated in such a way as to fall on the road in order to be identified as a problem that required management. So it was most definitely not just go out and rip all the trees out of the road reserve. It was what trees are likely to fail in the event of fire and disrupt road service. It was a very tightly defined objective. An inspection table you see there was developed by our arborists and has been trialled, reviewed and improved as each time this process goes out. So the outcome of this initial arborist assessment is to remove, retain or trim the tree, and then there's an environmental impact assessment process that's undertaken. Now there's a lot in this and I don't have a lot of time, so I am going to whiz through it, but essentially each tree identified for management was assessed for its environmental value, and the critical features that are assessed was obviously the size of the tree, the landscape location, habitat features such as hollows and signs of use by animals, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal heritage values, its landscape character. Cumulative impact assessment was undertaken, so we were not taking out too many trees within one area, and a glide tree assessment to make sure we're not removing potential glide trees from that particular piece of bush. Detailed guidance and training was being provided for each part of the assessment, and trees with high values were deferred subject to fuller environmental assessment. And there was rules around what trees had to be deferred, so it was consistently done. For every tree to be removed, a management strategy was required to determine whether removal, partial removal or further assessment within 5 years was required, the likely impact of removal on other significant trees, whether a soft fall technique was required, whether an inspection by an ecologist was required at the time of removal, the method of mulch management, and then follow-up activities such as slope stabilisation, weeding or artificial hollow creation. So, and that was done for each tree. I think there's a few people in the audience that went through that work, and I think they were pretty tired by the end of it, but they did a great job. So back at the office, what we called a streamlined review of environmental factors was completed. The completion of the template provided the basis for Transport to meet its environmental impact assessment obligations under Part 5. The template was populated through the information obtained from the pre- and on-grain assessment processes and required adherence to the environmental guides. The streamlined assessment template is only fit for that purpose, and it cannot be used for the deferred trees with high environmental values or removing trees from areas of high biodiversity significance. So, lessons learnt. That's me in high vis, people. I look like Elmer Fudd. It's like I've got the smallest hat in the shop and I've rammed it on my head, which I didn't realise at the time, but I do now. So what we found is doing it together works. So combined on-ground assessment by the arborist, environment staff, heritage staff and engineering staff together, working out what needs to be done in the management of a particular value was a really, really useful process to go through and has driven improved vegetation management and better coordination. We have, in my time, when there was no ecological consultants when I started, right? People used to do all this stuff in-house and they did it, and this pendulum sort of, we contract everything out and it's all consultants and they do a great job. I'm not bagging consultants, but there's also a line there, right, that we need to also make sure that in-house environmental staff can do their job too. The structured assessment pathways improve the overall quality of the REFs produced and the environmental outcomes achieved. We found that integration of environmental assessment information into the reporting systems has improved the visibility of environmental information. So the sort of pure asset manager engineering types actually know what it is that they're removing out of the landscape, and there's a sort of a better understanding of those issues within the department. On-ground training and capacity building was essential to make the approach work because it was quite a different model than we had traditionally done. And the streamlined REF process has delivered faster environmental assessments, largely due to a more efficient use of in-house and external environmental assessment expertise. So I think that's it.
Well, thanks very much, Julie. We've got our next presenter, and we're going to go back to the energy easements and essential energy this time. Unfortunately, as you would have planned or would have thought, we've had one or two people who couldn't come here due to COVID. Yes, it happened. And one of those is Brett Hayward, who actually presented at our last forum in 2019, did a great job. He always has a bit of a funky presentation. And he's handed the work over to Nathan Hegarty, also from Essential Energy. And Nathan's going to talk about innovation leading to better environmental outcomes. Nathan Hegarty.
Thanks, Neil. So I'm filling in for Brett today at fairly short notice, but so I can't take any credit for the presentation. Brett's done all that. Hopefully I can do it justice, but yeah, it's a bit of a different style presentation. It's sort of picture friendly and text light, so hopefully I can articulate everything that Brett was going to. So basically, the presentation today is on innovation, which basically everyone's been talking about. I guess in the traditional sense, when we think about innovation, we think about it being a driver for change, improving efficiencies, increased productivity, things like that, which usually have an economic outcome. But obviously, innovation also leads, as we've learnt and heard about all through today's session, leads to, quite often leads to better environmental outcomes. So just to put Essential Energy's network in context, so we're basically all of regional New South Wales, outside of Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong and the Blue Mountains. Cover about 95% of the state, excluding those areas, a little bit in southeast Queensland, up around Texas and Goondiwindi. So that's about 95% of the state, and then we've got about 200,000 kilometres of power lines. So it was interesting to see that it was about 185,000 kilometres of road network, so we're actually a little bit more than that, encompassing about 100 depots across the state. And if we go to our network specifically, so again, throughout New South Wales, just to give you some context of the density and the non-density parts of the network, as you'd imagine, we've got some collections of network that centre around more, the regional areas, big regional areas. So down in the sort of the southern area, there's a collection of red dots there around Wagga, Dubbo, Tamworth, and then, Port Macquarie, Coffs Harbour, Grafton along the coast. But then obviously out in Western New South Wales, we have big swathes of land which have a relatively low customer base, but hundreds of kilometres of power lines. And in actual fact, there's about 0.5% of the customer base requires about 17% of the length of the network. So that kind of puts it in perspective. And on top of all that, we, being across the whole state, we obviously work in a variety of different environments. So, ranging from the tablelands through to coastal forested areas to Alpine, got lots of network that goes up through Kosciuszko National Park, and even out in semi-arid, arid and desert regions of Western New South Wales. So I guess all of that, just that little bit of background, just gives you a feel for some of the network areas, some of the environmental areas that our network encompasses, and then can lead to some significant challenges. Probably, one of the most significant challenges we faced was the 1920 bushfire catastrophes across the state. And this is a handy little grab of stats. I won't run through all of it, but just things like 3,200 plus poles damaged or burnt to crisp. We had 4,500 cross arms damaged. 22,500 hazardous trees, which sort of was building on the previous speaker and the processes that we had to work through to make those safe. And then on top of all that, obviously, then we have floods, and that's been, ever since the bushfires finished, we seem to have had floods. So last year in Taree and Port Macquarie, they were both close to 1 in 100-year flood events and significant, damages to the network. And then we've just gone through a period unprecedented period in northern New South Wales around Lismore and Ballina. Obviously, just unprecedented and lots of damage and lots of effort to get power restored. So I guess that's, the challenges. So what I'm actually, I should have said this up front, the innovative technology I'm going to talk about today is standalone power systems, or SAPs as they've called. Now, in a real basic sense, they're basically a system that collects power from a solar panel, sometimes a generator, feeds into a battery. That's a demonstration model. So basically, you've got your solar array, a battery box which has got the switchgear and everything in it, and as I said, sometimes they're accompanied by a diesel generator as well. So there's two specific projects that I'd like to talk about today. One is at Bulahdelah, which is about 100 k's north of Newcastle, for those unfamiliar. It's in an area of National Park, very hard to get to. So basically, it's a 5.5 kilometre spur line that connects that goes between a private residence and Cutler's Cottage, which is in a national. It's the premises that's owned by National Parks. It then travels about 14 kilometres back to the main part of the network. So very remote. As you can see there, highly forested, being a national park, very dense veg, high bushfire risk, difficult terrain. That's the picture down the bottom here. So very undulating terrain, lots of creek crossings. So there's regular restrictions on access, just getting guys there to maintain and inspect the line. And then obviously, you add a natural event like a flood or a fire, and it makes things worse as well. So basically, what's happened here is that we've installed that might be the next slide. Installed SAP system actually at each of those sites. So one at the National Parks and Wildlife Cottage, and one at the private residence. And they both, the whole purpose of them are obviously to stand alone, as the name suggests, and provide energy for those facilities without the need eventually of the line to be there. So this one in Bulahdelah specifically was it's been it's owned by Essential Energy. It's been built in collaboration with Horizon Power. So a couple of the Western Power and Horizon Power are WA electricity providers, and they've been at the forefront of these designs. They have a similar, network footprint to Essential, large swathes of land with low customer base. But EE's, responsible for the operation, maintenance, faults, and emergency. And the one at the private residence has got a backup diesel generator, but the one at the Cutler's Cottage, Brett tells me shortly we're going to have a hydrogen generator as a backup, so it'll be a truly renewable setup there. So when there's not enough sun from the solar charging the batteries, hydrogen power will kick in. So at the moment, the customer's paying their usual retail price for the connection and supply. And that one this is the one at the private residence anyway. It's a 13 kilowatt solar system with 30 kilowatt hours of battery and a 14 kVA genset generator. Okay, yep. The second one is down at Selwyn in Kosciuszko National Park. So we've got there's a really important communications tower there that we supply electricity to via a 33 kV line. The tower is located about halfway along that 24 kilometre 33 kV line. That line was completely destroyed in the early 2020 bushfire. And so this was an emergency response, obviously, to get power back to that telecommunications tower. And basically this one, due to solar, just not really, just, with a bit of lack of sun and stuff, it's basically just a battery diesel generator set up. And again, in this case, we actually built a custom-made container to house it during winter, because obviously, snow conditions are a bit harsher on batteries and that sort of thing. So essentials of maintaining operation and maintenance and fault emergency for that one as well. But I guess the fact that it's there, I should say that the generator runtime has been below 3 days a week, so it sort of kicks in, charges the batteries up, and then the batteries operate it, to keep it running 24/7. And I'm told that, we only refuel it once through winter, so fairly efficient system. I'll wrap it up from there. So I guess the key positive outcomes from these standalone systems is obviously, it increases reliability to the networks, because you're not subject to such an extent to those natural events. There's obviously an array of environmental benefits if the corridor is returned, particularly in areas like National Park, where we can return those power lines basically to nature and managed by parks. Less vegetation maintenance for essential energy and the obvious cost savings associated with that. So again, it's a really interesting space to work in at the moment. Hopefully these have all been trial sites, and hopefully we can sort of really look at rolling these out at a larger scale.
Well, thanks a lot, Nathan. Our next presenter is Peter Dixon, and he was mentioned earlier on. He's done a lot of work in the environment space. Some of you might know him from some previous work over many years. Peter's here representing the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, and Peter's going to talk about helping nature do your work, adopting assisted natural regeneration in managing linear reserves. So it's very much about managing regeneration work. So welcome, Peter Dixon. Thanks a lot, Peter.
Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land and acknowledge the Gadigal mob. I'm visiting from Worimi country at the moment. So I'm from up near, a bit further north than Port Stephens, up around Wootton. So my name is Peter Dixon, President of the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators. Been president for a couple of years now, and I was president about 25 years ago, I think. And in between, I've worked in government, but I got better recently. So I run a small consultancy now, so I'm pretty much just self-unemployed. So ARBA, the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, a lot of you probably have heard of us, some of you may not have. We've operated in New South Wales. We're an NGO, operated in New South Wales since 1986, but we've had membership around Australia since that time. We now have an active branch in Victoria, and we've been in discussions to move to set up branches in South Australia, Tasmania and Queensland. So we're We're on a bit of an expansion phase at the moment. We're under a new constitution, and we're wanting to establish right across Australia with regional branches and state branches. Close to 1,500 members, but still relatively small NGO. Accordingly, we tend to do projects either in collaboration or when we get grants. We're not a cashed up organisation that can just do a lot by ourselves, but we do what we can. So we do have a YouTube channel called Regen TV, where we've got a lot of quite interesting videos about bush regeneration techniques, and we record conferences and forums that we have, so it's always worth a good look. We've had an active interest in linear reserves for the last few years. One of our board members, Jane Guy, who's sitting here ignoring me, is actually on the Roadside Environment Committee, although not wearing the Arbor hat, and we have had an interest in linear reserves. We've recently started and entered a conversation with Transport for New South Wales, and I want to acknowledge both Lee Trevitt and Julia Revallion for engaging with us and their positivity to date. It's early days, but we're just going to see where this can take us in terms of improving roadside management. Arbor is also part of a consortia of 15 peak restoration NGOs called the Restoration Decade Alliance. This is the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration, which I was a bit surprised hadn't been mentioned yet today. And so we've got a 10-year focus. I think there's an opportunity for all natural area managers to really push better management and increase management resources into your natural areas in this decade. This talk today is predominantly going to be about Regen 101. I'm going to start it from first principles, so a lot of you are probably way ahead of where this talk is, but it's probably easier just to start where I am. Oh, that was that slide. I want to say at the outset that I recognise and acknowledge that there's been innumerable really good examples of roadside management and linear reserve management generally, and a lot of them have been carried out by people in this room, so I absolutely acknowledge that. And in this 15 minutes, I'm going to have to speak mainly in generalities, so there's always going to be exceptions to sort of my opinions and comments here. I have had a history in roadside reserve management. I was involved in my first roadside project in 1994 with Brad Staggs at Wallandilly Council, and been worked on a lot of projects, both through Arbor, but also my time with catchment management and also with the New South Wales Environmental Trust. It's been a regular frustration of mine and also many others that while there are good examples of roadside management, linear reserve management, generally roadside reserve management is patchy, unstrategic at a state level, under-resourced and inequitable. And it's the case that many of the organisations, many of the councils that own the largest extent of roadsides are least able to manage it because they're the most under-resourced councils. And so there's a lot of inequity in the ability to do good roadside management. And despite the recognition that roadside reserves, linear reserves have been important, and they've been recognised as being important for as long as I can remember, there's often little thought given to the overall resourcing of it. So it's still seen to be the responsibility of a massive number of individual organisations rather than having a statewide approach for this, what is actually a statewide resource and a statewide important resource. There's often little thought given to the incremental improvement. So there's been so many cases, and hopefully you will agree with this, there's been so many cases where there's been really good management happening for a while, then staff move on, and then programs move backwards. And Port Stephens pointed this out earlier, that you had a program and then something happened, it sort of ceased for a while, now you're having to start up again. And once momentum is lost, it's always hard to gain momentum again. So my frustration is, is that I think we do need a different way of doing things, which is driven at a regional state level, that resourcing has to be given in a way that is equitable and actually gets the job done, actually improves the resource year by year. Now, I don't know what that could look like. I don't know what regulatory and policy change needs to happen, but I think there's been a lot of people say that we do need to have a fundamental look at how we manage linear reserves, because irrespective of the good work, irrespective of the good models, so much of the resource is going backwards, so much of the ecology is degrading. So today, I just want to propose bush regeneration, assisted natural regeneration, as one of the sorts of approaches we could use to manage linear reserves. Now, a quick note about what guides us. This is the front cover of the National Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration in Australia. Now, assisted natural regeneration actually started in Australia. The first known ANR project, Bush Regeneration Project, was in Broken Hill in the 1920s. And there's a great little video on the Arbor website if you want to have a squiz about that project. But bush regeneration as we know it today started about 7 kilometres from here, over at Mossman with the Bradley sisters, who you probably have heard of. The practice of, and they started what is now known as the modern practice of bush regeneration. It's moved on a lot since they instigated it, but we see our genesis there pretty much. Now the practice has spread and also has been independently invented in a lot of other countries. And so what we call bush regeneration here is known as assisted natural regeneration or facilitated natural regeneration right around the world now. And it's practiced in a lot of countries. Now, in Australia, the standard has been developed. This is the second version of the standard. It's been driven by the Society for Ecological Restoration Australia, and it uses the ANR principles to really document what is best practice in managing ecosystem restoration. Arbor was very deeply involved with the development of these. And it's in this decade of restoration, ecological restoration from the UN, it's Arbor's opinion that this should pretty much be adopted by all organisations managing natural areas, managing bushland. So bush regeneration has been around since the 60s. And yes, the SCR standards are pretty widely accepted, not just the bush regeneration background, but also a lot of other NGOs, government and industry. So bush regen's been around since the 60s, and the practices and methodologies have been consistently improving since then. It is successfully applied at multiple scales. There's regen projects over hundreds of square metres where there's critically endangered species present, or it's applied at scales of hundreds of square kilometres. In Borneo, they're applying assisted natural regeneration projects at thousands of square kilometres. So the actual methodologies of ANR are applicable anywhere. It differs from a lot of the standard weed and plant sort of projects, which a lot of bushland management still is, in so much as it relies as much as possible on the inherent ability of ecosystems to recover, the resilience, ecosystem resilience, so the ability of bush to regenerate by itself. And a lot of the work is not mechanistic in terms of trying to reach the end point. It's actually managing the recovery potential of the bush to see what can happen by itself, and the interventions are more around allowing for that regeneration to occur rather than actually planting. Although bush regenerators and bush regeneration does include weeding and planting, of course, but a lot of it is actually manipulating the biophysical elements. Research has shown again and again that areas restored through assisted natural regeneration are cheaper to manage in the long term and are much more resilient to natural and also anthropogenic pressures. So they recover from bushfires better, they recover from floods better, they recover from single clearing events better, or accidental vehicle entrance, or somebody going mad with a sprayer, which has happened. An important aspect of ANR and linear reserve management is that the regenerated core areas can expand quite readily into surrounding areas. And I was taken with you talk about Port Stephens of the markers. Now, the markers have been used for a long, long time, but it should be in my opinion, it should be the aim of all roadside projects to actually bring those markers back, expand them. So the areas adjacent to those, the buffer areas, should be expanded and regenerated so that all your roadsides are important habitat. So one of the easiest ways to visualise bush regeneration and also or assisted natural regeneration is on a spectrum. So if you look at this, very low capacity, recovery capacity, so degraded bush on the right-hand side, really good bush on the right-hand side. In terms of restoration approach, spontaneous regeneration happens in good bush. We all know that. A lot of the guidance on roadside management recognises good bush looks after itself in a lot of cases. And it's true that most of the bush, good bush along linear reserves is good because it doesn't have the pressures on it and it's going to stay good as long as you don't let negative processes happen in there. At the reconstruction end, it's the areas that have been totally trashed, cleared for a long time, overgrazed, nutrients have changed, soil profiles have changed, and that needs a reconstruction approach. By reconstruction, it's generally, planting, bush gardening. And it's this area in the middle where assisted natural regeneration, I think, can be incorporated much more often into linear reserve programs. It's the areas where the bushland is a little bit degraded, and if left by itself, it will probably degrade more. But with some interventions, it will actually restore and recover. 2 minutes. So the sort of interventions that I'd be arguing for bushland reserve, for linear reserves, restating hydrological regimes. A lot of bushland degrades because it gets too wet, especially along roadsides. So drainage is critical in road design and road maintenance. Installing and promoting habitat features. So artificial hollows is one, but also ground cover, letting stuff, logs on the ground, stopping bush rockers, putting artificial rocks back in, potentially, as has been done in occasions. Reintroducing appropriate fire regimes, and great opportunities there for engaging with Indigenous communities. Systematically removing competition, weeding, get out there and pull out the weeds. And combined assisted regeneration and reintroductions. It can be really simple. Now, very quickly, I worked on a restoration project in Vietnam where clearing for agriculture, small areas, had stopped the rainforest from regenerating, and vines had come up around the edge and was actually systematically destroying the rainforest. The only interventions we needed to restore this rainforest was to skirt the vines and to put tomato stakes with a bit of dowel on top in the cleared areas. Then birds would come in and crap out the seeds, and that restored the rainforest. Sometimes your interventions can be extraordinarily elegant. Sometimes not. But for any one area, there's a lot, this is sort of the scope of things you've got to do. So it's the weeding and planting is down the bottom end. It's the other interventions first. So transitioning into bush regeneration, I think, is something which a lot of you could do if you're not using assisted natural regeneration techniques. It is something that can be introduced, whether as a trial or an adjunct to your existing programs, just to see how it works. And I would encourage you to actually do the cost benefit on it. And I think you'll find that in a lot of cases that it would actually be a great adjunct to your current programs. Local government is the major implementer of bush regeneration in New South Wales, so it's not a scary thing for local governments. There's precedent, and nothing works better in local government than precedent. One thing we're doing is we are working, Arbor provides a lot of guidance and information. I mentioned Regen TV, but we also do provide written guidance at times. And I'm keen to work with councils on developing guidance specifically for the management of linear reserves. We're in the throes at the moment of developing a linear reserves policy statement or position statement for Arbor. And we want to pull together some case studies because there are actually a lot of regen projects happening on roadsides. And so if we can start pulling them together as case studies, it can also act as an argument for you as land managers to take it to your powers that be to see whether these can be implemented in your area. And I'd like to continue the conversation. Please contact me, President at Arbor, and I'd love to have a chat with you about your circumstances, whether I can give you some advice about how to communicate to your councils about introducing assisted natural regeneration or bush regeneration, and I can just give you some general advice about how to go about it and who to talk to about organisations where it succeeded previously. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Now, just in the remaining minutes, we've got an opportunity to open up the floor a little bit. We've heard lots of presentations, lots of issues discussed, lots of solutions. So we're going to have a little panel session. As I said, we'll finish certainly at 4 o'clock. But also I've just noticed we've got about 30 Slido questions. We won't be able to go through all of them, but some of them are to specific presenters, and I think most have stayed. So we'll try and get some of those questions answered. But I'd like to welcome to the stage our three panel members. Rod, who you met before as our keynote speaker. Martin Driver, who's the chair of the New South Wales Roadside Environment Committee. And welcome to the stage, we've got Sally Durham from Transport for New South Wales. Now, Sally is a director at Transport for New South Wales, and she's responsible for the environmental management and advice for all road and rail development projects outside Greater Sydney, and for environmental management and advice associated with the ongoing operation of the road and rail network in regional New South Wales. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions to you, Sally, and there is a microphone there, and it should be on. And I've got two questions. The first one is, how would you describe the role of Transport for New South Wales and local government in managing roadside vegetation?
Okay, so for most of the road network in New South Wales, it's actually local government that looks after the roadside, except for some motorways and some freeways as well. But for Transport for New South Wales, our role in managing roadside vegetation is whenever we are doing works to maintain the roads, we have a responsibility to make sure that we look after the roadside vegetation, the flora, fauna, when we're doing those works, and making sure that we don't have impacts in that way. We maintain our roadsides for normal operation of the roads in terms of managing vegetation for sight distance and roadside furniture. So we do general routine maintenance, but we have that role in just looking after the roadside vegetation and making sure we don't impact when we're doing our works. That's been our traditional type of management, and I know there's this ongoing whose role is it, council or transport, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that as we
Okay.
go along.
And I've got one other question. What are the opportunities for Transport for New South Wales to better improve vegetation management in linear corridors?
Well, so I think that it's clear we need to think a little bit differently now, and I think we are moving into that space where we're going to take a bit more of a landscape-wide approach rather than we just do the road and we don't do anything else. Now, I know it's a kind of a long time coming, but it does look like we have some leadership who is quite keen on that approach, and we've got some interesting things coming where we're looking at working similar to some of the discussions that we're here today, working with Aboriginal groups and looking at working with them to do corridor management, like taking a full corridor approach and looking at doing work programs and all sorts of learnings in that way. Alongside that, we are also, the policy that Julie was talking about, she mentioned before, the biodiversity policy. This is a really new approach for us, and it fills a gap of all the little projects which currently don't address the impacts when we're removing vegetation along roadsides. And part of that will be a biodiversity conservation fund. And so it's actually putting a value on trees and hollows, and so that will give us a fund with which we can do some conservation projects. And so that's something which will be really exciting, because we will be able to look at our whole landscape and assess where we would high value areas and find particular areas to do projects, and also perhaps combining that with working with some of the Aboriginal land management processes. So there's things there are things on the horizon, which is great.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Sally. I've got a question for Rod that's come through via Slido. Hi, Rod.
Hello.
Do you have any insights into roadside ecology management that could or should be applied to urban roadsides?
Good question. Hello, whoever asked that question. I think, I don't know where rural or regional ends and urban actually begins. So I actually can't see how it would be different, the principles. I think it might differ in the types of things we can do, and maybe the width of the road reserve. Well, it's still maybe a 20 metre wide road reserve, but instead of having a 3 or 4 metre, like on the picture there, narrow gravel road, we've got a 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 metre wide. So we've got less space to play in, but we're still actually doing some of the similar things. Does that answer the question that whoever asked?
The question was asked by Anonymous.
Anonymous.
And it wasn't me.
Yeah. I think we're still doing the same sorts of things. It's just a different scale, spatial scale, and maybe a different intensity. And our expectations should be different. If we're managing this road reserve, we're looking for something that's approaching, pre-European remnant kind of ideas. In an urban area, we actually want trees that survive, provide shade, don't fall on cars, don't kill people walking on. You know what I mean? That's a different kind of ambitions, but we still want habitat, we still want vegetation.
Okay. Thanks, Rod. And another question from Anonymous. I don't know whether it's the same or not. Anonymous. How do we get road builders to add in ecological consideration to all their constructions as a matter of default?
I think the New South Wales biodiversity policy is going to fix that. So there's a lot of what we've talked about today, the bat stuff that Alicia was talking about, that's for endangered species, but there's still another 20 odd species of bats, maybe more in New South Wales, that are still affected by what we do. To answer the question, it relies on policy and regulations that specify certain standards, because people who build roads have to plan them, they have to get approval for them, and if there's some legislation that triggers that, then that will hopefully look after the common species. But
I can probably
Sally,
add a
yep.
little bit to that. And you mentioned policy, and yes, so Transport has got a new sustainability policy, and that is a very good driver for us. That was signed off at the end of last year, and that's got sort of eight focus areas, and one of those is no net loss of biodiversity is one of the things in there. Now that actually is quite interesting in our projects, because and we have to report on that, and that will drive a lot, because every project has to, from strategic business case, so really early planning through to final business case, and that has to talk about how you're going to meet each of those pillars. And so it will require a bit more thinking, and hopefully we can drive, and part of our role in environment sustainability is to help projects with that, and helping projects to look at how they can implement proper processes to help preserve ecological values. Yeah.
And I think to follow on from that, if we are too specific about what construction companies need to do in terms of the physical things that they build, then we kind of stifle their innovation. Quite a number of projects where the construction people have this idea, and it's a bit out there sometimes, but that's often where things get sort of, these ideas turn into concrete realities, and these ideas get tested. So I don't think we want to be too specific, about what it actually is, except that the ambition is some sort of no net loss or
Achieve, yeah.
improved condition.
Yep, Martin?
Just a little point on that. You're both saying things where we've got to with the roadside corridors, etc. These things are artefacts of decisions that were made a long time ago for completely different purposes. And I think that's the thing. We've got a whole lot of systems now which are not fit for purpose. And we've got to the stage where now we've got to start to make active decisions about designing the future and what we want from these artefacts that have been left over from past decisions. And we've got a whole lot of systems, bureaucracies, tenures, etc., which are not fit for current purpose from my view, but they're hard to change. And it's these gradual policy changes which will drive the direction to support the systems that we've got from a past time and modify it. And it'll make us start to think about, okay, well, we've got these things. How do we move that? It's policy, it's support, I think the Roadside Committee has really got the communication going about why these things are important and how we can all work together. And I think as the organisations that are represented, you know, we think that things have been slow in lots of ways, but I think so much has been achieved, and I think it has been really positive. And I think, yeah, more power to all of you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot to all. Now, this one, I think maybe Martin, you can have a go at this one. It's once again from Anonymous, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this one. A burning question. You'll find out why in a moment. I think you know where I'm going to go with this. In rural New South Wales, one of the greatest threats to road reserves is land clearing for fencing infrastructure. How can this be better managed rather than a 25 metre of veg cut?
Yeah, it's a loaded one, isn't it? The whole issue of fire and weed management is something that we've tried to look at and address the Roadside Environment Committee. Again, there's multiple groups involved and some conflicting controls, etc. But I think, you know, at a local government level, we've got to start to realise that the roadsides is not, you know, or should not be the excuse for cultivation and clearing using public land of high value, not just high economic value, but high environmental values, to be the sacrifice point for regional fire strategies. We've got to be smarter about that. In fact, a lot of the research shows that it's more likely that wind velocities, etc., are slowed at those areas where there's heavy vegetation. It's the open grasslands and cleared areas that are high fire risk, high fire speed areas that feed the fires. And clearing using public land as that final resort is probably not as smart as having a well designed and constructed fire zones and fire break areas to work off some of these areas. Yeah, it shouldn't be the default. And that's a personal view. But again, I think we need to really sit down and work at these things at the regional level with those, local governments and others, and the Regional Fire Service, RFS, who are on the committee as well. But the regional fire strategies, I think there are problems currently with some of the regional fire strategies.
All right. Okay, so we've got a few questions that are fairly specific, but if the panellists want to add to them, we've got a question, I think it's to Paul, about drones. Where's Paul? Is Paul still with us? And you might answer it just off that mic because, as I said, all this has been recorded. So the question is, what is the purpose of the bird devices? Is it stopping injury to birds or stopping birds perching on infrastructure?
It's the former, and in particular on that Ash Island job, you may have seen it in the footage. There was a large lake there behind the distribution line full of black swans. if you actually walked the easement, there was sections that already had the bird diverters installed. There was no evidence at all of any bird strikes. You got to the area where there wasn't any bird diverters, and there was clearly bird fatalities. So it's been proven as quite an effective tool, but certainly the former.
All right, thanks, Paul. I think we've got one or two. Is Hayden still here? Do you want to just go up to the mic? We've got a few questions. Thanks for that, Paul. Hayden, are the QR codes on the markers open access so public can view the threatened species data?
Yeah, so they are open. Yeah, like theoretically you could pull up on the side of the road and scan it. It's not going to pull up data on the threatened species. It'll pull up the field guide, so your standard operating procedures. Yeah, and so it'll tell you what marker it is, like say amphibian or wetland or whatever, but it won't tell you what species that amphibian is or anything like that.
Okay, thanks, Hayden. We've got one for Peter Dixon. Hi, Peter. Hi. Do you feel the Biosecurity Act hinders or helps management of roadside reserves given the nil tenure approach expected of weed management now?
My God, that was my mother's dying words. The answer is I think the Biosecurity Act will let you do what you want to do or let you not do what you want to do. So I don't think it is clearly enough indicated that you should or should not do. I'm not wording this properly. There's too many loopholes, let's put it that way. I think that's how I'd answer it.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Peter. Back to the panel. Here's a general kind of question. How do we get road builders to add in ecological considerations to all their constructions as a matter of default? We had that one, that's right. Yeah, I think that one's kind of flipping up again. So just over to you, Rod, just whilst I'm going through this, what's a bit of a take-home? You gave a take-home to start with, but you've heard a lot of presentations since, and you've got a lot of expertise in this area and also a long history in it. Have you learned anything today from listening to the presentations that would kind of that you think should be added to kind of the initial discussion or supports what you said to start with?
Yep, I think so. There's two things that I've sort of realised, or it's been ingrained in my head. The first is that I guess ending with Peter's presentation about just let nature do its thing as well. So we don't have to be interventionist all the time. We could just let assisted natural recovery. That's what it's called. Yep, do its thing. And the other is there's innovation. So drones, really good example. The rooftop, rooftop tents, almost a rooftop tent for bats. The precast concrete structures. So there's innovation, and so I guess it's at one end innovation and technology and QR codes and so standard operating procedures on the side of roads. Since when does a bulldozer driver take a document with him? He's definitely got his phone because he's got to look at TikTok at lunchtime. So, taking use of the technology and innovation, but also letting nature do its thing.
By the way, that's what I'm on at the moment, TikTok. No, thanks a lot, Rod. So over to Matt. Is Matt still here? Okay, we've got three for you, Matt. Matt, how heavy is the gear? Can it be easily carried into the bush, or do you need EWP to get up tree or other vehicle to get it to site?
Good question. So yes, look at the tools, the kit itself is a generator that weighs about 20 kilos that I can carry in one hand, a standard blowback that you buy from an equipment store, a small grinder, and then attachments to that. And it's everything you need can go into a wheelbarrow, so it's that size. It runs off electricity, so there's power leads is the main thing. So you're limited by the length of a power lead, and that's it. It works anywhere you like, from ground through EWPs to climbers. So mostly I've got climbers doing the works, or there are most of the people with the tools are climbers. So they'll be harnessed up and they'll head up the tree, carving hollow cavities from a diameter of a trunk that size up to whatever's needed. So, yeah.
Thank you, Matt. Question 2. A really positive story, Matt. Presumably you aren't destroying old dead trees to create your wooden collars. Yeah.
Yes, so that's correct. So one of the big criticisms about people, like if you think about don't take bush rock from the bush, it's the same thing. Don't take old hollow material from the bush. So if it's on the ground and it's hollow, we're invariably not using it. I carve those, so it's 5 minutes to carve any of those little entrance sizes and collars. And we're doing that in a way because we're targeting specific species anyway. So I'm looking at kind of creating specific entrance diameters, maybe putting a bend in an entrance so a Indian miner can't fly directly into a hollow, all of those types of things. So yes.
And question 3, what research is undertaken for the content of the hollow? Some species nest in hollows where the pith has decayed. Are grindings left in the hollow?
So combination, and I think that's a really good thing. Obviously with nest boxes, they've been, over the past while, they've been putting handfuls of mulch and other material into the base of the nest box. The way I think of it is, if I'm a possum or a bird turning up and there's this crack, a hollow sitting there, it's right dimensions, everything, but it's pristine and nothing's been using it. If I was the fauna, I'd look at that and say, well, if nothing else is using it, neither am I. So putting in bedding material like mulch or termite mud guts, things like that, actually seems to encourage some species to use the hollows.
Okay, thanks a lot, Matt. David, you didn't get off the hook. You've got 2 questions. Question 1, how did the vegetation on roadsides compare to non-linear natural areas?
That's my question. No, I'm joking.
It's anonymous. Again.
So how did vegetation on roadsides compare with what?
Non-linear natural areas.
Oh, okay. Well, our study, we lumped all of the non-roadside sites together, the 111 of them. So I couldn't really tell you, but I would imagine that those non-linear or those natural areas would have been not as good as the roadside, but probably not too bad. Certainly not as good as the paddock. That's probably all I could say without looking at the data.
Maybe I can add to that. So 25 years ago, I also surveyed habitat in probably 35 kilometres of roadsides around Euroa. And just looking at the number of large trees and the number of hollow-bearing trees, between 20 and 30 per hectare on these road reserves and roadsides, and less than 2 or 3 per hectare in nearby patches of state forest. And that's because the state forests have been logged, 5 times since European settlement. So the roadsides are fantastic compared to most blocks of state forest in Victoria, at least.
Thanks, Ryan.
And I think that holds true because, again, the bigger blocks are grazed.
Yeah, okay. All right, so your second question, David. Maybe landholders could reap some reward for leaving their roadside reserves alone. A campaign of their value, if possible, could offset farming? That's 2 little questions.
Interesting. I'm not really sure. I don't really understand the question because landholders don't own the reserves unless we're talking about reserves that they're perhaps managing under some agreement with council. Are we? I don't know. Does anyone want to own that question?
Is the inference there that I interpret that it's the general landowners, so whether it's local government.
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, this has always amazed me that local councils aren't jumping on the bandwagon to try and reap biodiversity benefits, carbon benefits, hydrology benefits all of these benefits that other landholders are able to apply for, because these systems have really high levels of carbon and they're very productive. So yeah, I think definitely councils and other managers of roadside vegetation could actually reap some financial benefits from them.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, David. Hayden, we're going to go back to you. Yeah. They're all over your presentation. Slido went viral.
Yeah.
Bing, bing. So, is there an opportunity to use your roadside markers to educate the public and potentially use in citizen science?
Yeah, I guess so. So yeah, you could apply it to like environmental education purposes. I suppose I was talking to someone about this earlier, but I suppose you wouldn't want to keep it in the roadside as often as we have the maintenance markers, because you'll have people stopping all the time in the roadside, and it's probably a bit of a safety risk then. But yeah, definitely the same sort of idea of QR codes and opening up web pages with relevant information for those areas. Yeah, definitely something to look into, I think.
For a long time, I've
Hayden, just stay there.
yeah. There's
please.
more. There's more coming. Yeah, I just
There's
gonna
more.
say that the whole system of there's a whole lot of surveys of roadsides and the qualities of roadsides and the educational material potential there that I've thought for a long time. Now that we've got technology of GPS in cars and et cetera, I think there's a real opportunity for wider public education, that when you're driving down a section of road, that you could actually get voice information about what you're looking at in general terms. You're not going to identify, rare orchids at this point or anything like that, but this is what you're looking at, the last of the good quality white box along this section of road. This is managed by such and such for this purpose. I think there is a real, as I said this morning, it's the roadsides and the travelling is one of the few points of contact between people and the wider environment. But they don't know what's there, and we've got an opportunity to use the technology that's there today to really, for a tourism point of view, I think there's a whole lot of benefits to regional communities that we can use this data for, the TSR networks, etc. Most people wouldn't know what they are, where they are, but to actually, what you're seeing here on your left is, and you could actually have options along the way to select different information that you want to get. And I think that is a state project that for a long time, I think the technology's there, we just need the resourcing and perhaps support from NRMA funding or someone to pull it all together, because it's I may be a bit fanciful, but I think public education on these issues is really important.
I reckon you need better coverage from Telstra. Lose it. It comes in a city and then you miss.
Yes.
We could also use. Oh, you go, Peter.
I was going to say,
Yeah,
add to
Peter.
that, how many roadside rest stops are there in New South Wales? Perfect place to put a QR code.
Yeah.
And we could also use the barcodes to shame whoever's not doing the proper management. So this should be managed better by blah, blah, blah.
Okay, so you got another question, Hayden. As I said, you were very popular on Slido. And the question is Port Stephens Council implementing management methods to expand frog and orchid habitat beyond its current roadside range?
Yeah, so we do have arms of, not necessarily my team, but we do have like a natural systems arm that does a lot of bush regen and bush projects and that sort of thing. Probably not specifically aimed at the areas that I talked about with the amphibians in those areas, but yeah, could easily be a future project or part of their dedicated work as well, for sure.
Okay.
Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Hayden. Mr. Durrington, come on down. You got 3.
Has the consultant got out of the train?
The first one is, hi Luke, how often is the network mapped?
Very infrequently. I think, in between, we really avoid trying to do the whole network in one go too often. This was probably the first time it had been mapped in probably 10 years. So it's quite labour intensive, and we try and do more frequent, smaller surveys. And we've been working with the councils, because often we find the councils and their weed officers want to be out there pretty regularly anyway. So generally, there's been a few different councils using different methods. Some of them are doing it via vehicle. Others have been coming along with me on the train, and the Central Coast guys have been. They get on there actually with a GoPro and record everything they see out the window. So we've tried a few different things, and we do a few smaller surveys, but regular whole of network surveys are pretty infrequent. We don't have a schedule at this point.
Okay. All right. You've got another one. Any community opposition to the weed removal? And some vegetation from visual perspective better than cleared? Question mark.
Yeah, not so much on the scale that we're treating things. Most of the things we're aiming for in this program are sort of high threat weeds. So we're looking for things like bone seed and bitter bush and Misel thorn and these sorts of things, which there's generally not the volume there that they're creating a screening. That's more likely to occur. We still have a separate program for corridor vegetation management, which manages sort of right of way, and that's where we run into that sort of thing. And sometimes where we do need to do some replanting there, so we do some replanting for screening. I think at the moment they're busy removing a lot of the bamboo of the past, which they planted last time for screening, and since have learnt that maybe that wasn't such a good idea. So yeah, there is a bit of that where we need to manage that visual side of things as well.
Okay. And the very last question, does your plan also take into account abandoned rail?
Abandoned rail? No, we don't have any for Sydney Trains. So all of ours is an operational network. That would be probably Country Rail Network, where they have some of that.
Yeah, I could add something there about Country Rail Network, because Country Rail Network has recently come into the whole transport portfolio, and we are looking at doing some conservation mapping on those we've got a lot of non-operational Country Rail Network, and a lot of opportunity to do all sorts of good conservation programs there, and so we are looking at starting that. And some of the landscape scale management programs I was talking about, looking at some of that Country Rail land to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Luke. Just a couple last questions. Have we got Matt still from Blacktown Council? Hey, Matt. We've got a question about your presentation. Any estimates from Blacktown Council on the value, amount of land in hectares, increased tree canopy, which would be open up for tree planting?
Yeah, good question. The lineal measure is 1,800 kilometres, and a lot of that is the 50, 60 and 70k road, which we're targeting in this study. Varying widths, I don't have a square metre or square hectare measure there, but it's a lot.
Okay, all right. I think that might have answered the question. Thanks, Matt. Thank you. All right, we've just got time for like a take-home from each of our panellists. The question I'd like to ask is, what do you see as the future of linear reserve environmental management? You've really kind of spoken to this, Rod, to a certain extent already, in New South Wales, and some really good opportunities. So firstly, we start off with you, Sally. The future, what does it hold?
Well, from being here today, I think it's really exciting just seeing all the different things that people are working on, and it makes me think, oh great, I'm going to go and contact that person, and it's about working together and using the information that we're all gathering in different ways and bringing it all together and being able to put that together and stop working in silos as much as possible. So I suppose that's a really important thing for me. I really find that very exciting that we can think a bit differently about the way we do things.
All right. Thanks, Sally. Martin, your kind of take home for the future.
Yeah, again, I think it's really positive to see all the things that are going on. It also highlights that so many people are keen on doing things, but the conflicting sort of tenures and responsibilities thing is really been highlighted to my mind. That's something that needs addressing, but I don't think it's going to happen quickly. But I think that sort of the policy change and direction is needed. And also, I think, it's really highlighting that it is the tragedy of the commons that we have all these areas that are sort of owned and controlled by everybody in a sense, but there's no resourcing from anyone that's designated at a state level. We need a resourcing central point of contact and policy to really drive these things. Yeah. And
over to Rod.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to take the opportunity to answer, Chris, the question you posed, and it's still on slide 0. So what do you think are the most important landscape? And it sort of goes to my final thing as well. What do you think are the most important landscape level predictors of roadkill, and how do we model areas where roadkill isn't reported? And I think I touched on that a bit in my presentation. So we need to collect roadkill data better. I'd also point out that places where there's very little roadkill may actually be so there's a low level of roadkill could actually be much worse for conservation than areas where there's a shitload of animals getting killed, to put it bluntly, because the areas where there's low levels of, let's say there's one koala getting killed every 2 years, that's because the population there has been decimated for the past 50 years. Where there's 20 koalas, maybe I'll use a different example because that's not a good one. Where there's a high number of animals getting killed somewhere else, that's just because there's a really, great population and it's good bush and it's, lots of animals doing what animals do and making baby animals and stuff. So the point, so from a conservation perspective, let's not rely on high rates of roadkill as being one of the single things that influence where we put mitigation measures. But it's understanding, where the best quality habitat is, because if we can stop the roadkill there, we might actually repopulate areas of really good quality habitat for wildlife. And I think that's, we know where some animals, we know what's good quality habitat for many species. So that would be, as well as the number of animals getting killed, it's where is the best quality habitat. And that's how I would be, identifying where we should be putting in those mitigation measures. And the other thing would be crossing structures don't stop roadkill. Crossing structures improve connectivity. Fencing stop the roadkill. So it's about putting both things together.
Well, thanks a lot. Can you please thank our 3 panel members? All right, just in conclusion, thanks very much for attending the day. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learned a lot. I certainly learned a lot. There is an online feedback questionnaire which we will email to you. Please give us some feedback, because we'd like to learn, did this work? Should we do it again? In what way? What didn't work? What could be improved? And that's the way we learn, and the Roadside Environment Committee learns about whether this forum is a good idea. The last one was in 2019. The previous one was in 2012. Should this be something that's done regularly into the future? And we just need that feedback to learn from you. I'd also like to thank a special member of the team that put this all together, and she's sitting up the back, and I'd like Kelsey, please stand up. Come on. Now, Kelsey has probably been in contact with you all. By the way, she's got a PhD in geology, not event management. And she's done a fantastic job of pulling this together. We have had some issues around COVID and other, management issues, as you do with forums. But Kelsey's done a wonderful job, so thanks very much to her for all her help. And also just to say that we are going to have a little drink afterwards. This is outside of the forum. We're not shouting the bar, and I'm sure the chair isn't. But we're just going to go down to the Sydney Brewery at Surrey Hills just to have a very informal drink, which is outside of work hours. You're more than welcome to come down. It's at 28 Albion Street, Surrey Hills, and it's very close to here, so just around the corner. So, we'll be there for a little while just to have a drink after it. But appreciate your time. Safe journeys home, and thanks a lot for your participation. And Julie.
One last thing. On behalf of everyone here and the community, we'd like to thank you.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's all right. No worries. Well, we finished with 3 minutes to go, so there you go. Thanks very much, everybody.